think you'll all agree with me that it's been an action-packed morning and a lot of fun, in fact, for the charity nerds in the room. And we've got more fun coming now. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, Associate Professor Rosemary Langford, who's going to give us, deliver a keynote address to us now. Just very briefly, by way of introduction here, Rosemary, of course, is working at the Melbourne Law School, where she's a very valued colleague, and she's a world-leading expert in governance. Her work to date has largely been in governance of for-profit corporations, and she's written extensively in that field, including a couple of landmark books. But recently she was awarded a very significant research grant from the Australian government, so some $500,000 or more, to undertake a multi-year project looking at the governance of not-for-profit organisations. And so Rosemary's thinking long and hard about this and very quickly acquiring an expertise and authority on this that very few, if any, can match. So I'm really delighted that Rosemary's here today, and she's going to talk to us about some of the early work she's done in thinking through questions of governance with an application for the charity and not-for-profit sector. So Rosemary, over to you on the topic of purpose-based governance. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thanks, Matthew. Well, Matthew did say he was just going to say here's Rosemary, so that was a little bit more than here's Rosemary, but here we go. So why do we value charities? Well, one of the reasons we value charities is their purpose. One of the key reasons for which we value charities, of course, as I said, is their purpose. A charity's purpose encourages vision, commitment and volunteering. It motivates employees, drives performance and also operates, if you like, as a safety mechanism. I won't, by the way, read out all the quotes. I've included some quotes here because the slides will be uploaded, but you can see there from Robinson, Judd and Errington, being purpose-driven affects the entire character and operation of a charity. The AICD not-for-profit principles state that purpose is the centrepiece of governance in the not-for-profit sector. And when I was reading through the lovely and long 2010 productivity report, I noted their comment that volunteers who understand and believe in the mission or purpose of an organisation are more likely to continue volunteering. So that's just a snapshot of how important purpose is in this sector. We also know that charities that stray from their purpose may lose their charitable or tax registration, and that the ACNC may investigate when a charity strays from its purposes. A charity's purpose and activities connected with that purpose will also partly determine which laws, codes and regulations they're subject to. So purpose is central. My question is, how does purpose affect governance? There are so many governance theories out there, but I have a theory of purpose-based governance, of governance surrounding purpose. So the structure of my presentation is as follows. First, I'm going to look briefly at the advantages of, or what I believe the advantages are of a purpose-based model of governance. I'll then explain what that model looks like for charities. I'll look briefly at the theoretical basis. I'll then look at the application of the model in relation to social enterprises and then at for-profit companies. Finally, I'll look at what I believe is a key need, which is to simplify and synthesise governance requirements. All of this is very brief because I just have 20 to 25 minutes. I'd love to have your comments and questions at the end or over a cup of tea or glass of wine later. My methodology is design thinking, and that necessarily involves testing ideas and refining them. I have a thick skin, so feel free to just say whatever you think. So this is necessarily an overview, but I'm very happy to discuss aspects with you later. Okay, so what are the advantages of a purpose-based governance model? Firstly, it has the potential to apply across the board to many different types of organisation. Secondly, I believe that it helps us to approach persistent governance problems through a different lens, in a different way. So, for example, issues relating to perceived tension between the best interests of an entity as an entity and its purposes that I'll touch on, and also issues relating to stakeholder demands. Purpose-based governance gives us an alternative model to looking at principles of distributive justice, another lens through which to solve these problems. Thirdly, at the very least, purpose-based governance sets the boundaries around governance. It tells people who govern organisations what they cannot do. It makes sense of other governance rules. For example, duties relating to avoiding conflicts and profits seek to ensure that those who govern entities focus on the purpose and aren't tempted away from focusing on that purpose by self-interest. For this reason, and more broadly, I believe, a focus on purpose has organisational and motivational advantages. Organising governance and compliance around purpose, and I'm about to show you how I envisage that, makes sense of, and I believe detangles complex governance requirements. It also explains the need for compliance, and I believe that that has motivational value. Purpose also, I think, sets the foundation for determination and outworking of the entity's values and culture, and that's something that's been recognised in the UK in their corporate governance code. And finally, I believe it helps us understand what law and regulation should look like. So let's get into it. What do I mean by purpose-based governance? And I'll probably win the prize for the worst diagrams. They were surgically done by my husband, who's a medical practitioner. But I did ask my 19-year-old son and he said no. So okay, my focus today is on charitable entities rather than all not-for-profit at this point. Okay. And when I refer to charitable entities, I'm referring to all types of charitable entities, so trusts, companies, incorporated associations, unincorporated associations, statutory bodies and cooperatives. I'm also going to use the term responsible person to refer to the people who govern organisations, so directors, trustees, members of management committees. Okay, so my vision is a purpose-based governance system, a system of governance centred around obligations surrounding purpose-based loyalty, so fidelity to purpose. So this model sees the entity's purpose or purposes as the centrepiece of governance, with the other requirements emanating from and supporting that purpose. The core duty, I believe, of responsible persons is to act in good faith in what they consider will further the entity's purposes. Okay, so that's my imperfect diagram. Now, let's look at each of those duties and how they're affected by purpose. Now, I'm putting the governance standards up next. Anyone who can read it from the back without glasses, I think I could give a Freddo frog later. But I'm using the governance standards because they apply to all entities in the charitable sphere. We know that there is a multitude of different obligations arising from different statutes and from general law, phrased in different terms, and I'll get onto that. But I'm just going to talk about the core duties referring to the governance standards. Okay, so firstly I would note, and I do apologise, it's so small and that's not my husband's fault, charities must be not-for-profit and work towards their charitable purpose. We've got a clear statement there of the importance of purpose. When we get to the duties of responsible persons, we know that a registered entity must take reasonable steps to make sure its responsible entities are subject to and comply with these duties. And so what I want to just briefly do is look at each of these duties and how they're connected with purpose. I'm going to actually look at the second duty first because I believe that that's the core of governance. So the duty there in B requires responsible persons to act in good faith in the registered entity's best interests and to further the purposes of the registered charity. The first part of this requires responsible persons to act in good faith in the interests of the entity. Easy, right? What are an entity's interests? The million-dollar questions. So for charitable entities at least, I believe their interests are tied up with the entity's purposes. Purposes is integral in that the interests of an entity include, or I would say consist of, its purposes. So this duty has been formulated in different ways. As I said, a duty to act in good faith in the interests of the charity's purposes, and I've seen it phrased in a different context in the UK as, wait for it, a duty to exercise powers in good faith in the way that a responsible person considers would further the charity's purposes. Okay, so we can talk about that later. What does it require? it's not outcomes based. It's based on good faith consideration of the entity's purposes and action directed towards those purposes. It's not tested by achievement of the purpose, and it's not breached if those purposes aren't achieved. Now, built into best interests are, of course, other things like independent judgment, genuine consideration, impartiality, and that sort of thing. So the next question is, what if there's a tension between the interests of the entity as an entity and the pursuit of the charitable purposes, in that the entity's interests in long-term sustainability might clash with its overall purposes, and an example might be the mergers context. Now, these decisions, these choices are never clear-cut. You can't lay down the law for all these decisions, but I believe that given that purpose is a clear or the predominant interest of charitable entities, purpose has extra weight in these contexts in sorting out this tension. It operates, I think, as a tiebreaker or a casting vote, where in resolving the tension between the interests of the entity as an entity and its purposes. Purposes need to have a defining role in what we consider to be the interests of the entity. Purpose, I think also, a purpose-based governance model also justifies a longer-term view of decision-making in the sense that an entity's purpose can endure beyond the existence of the members and the entity. And I think that would assist in situations such as those involved in the Bread Institute case, for example. Okay, so going back to our standards, oops, that's the wrong way. So I've talked about acting in good faith. What about proper purposes? Well, the governance standards don't have a duty to act for proper purposes. They refer to furthering the purposes of the registered entity. So that, as I said, affects what the interests of the entity are, but it also encompasses what we know as the proper purposes rule of general law, which requires responsible persons to act for proper purposes, so they're in breach if they act for improper purposes. Now, that's all the more important in the charitable sphere, in that straying outside of purposes, acting for improper purposes, might jeopardise a charity's status and registration. In some ways, the proper purpose duty is it's easier to apply in the charity's context than the commercial context, because the charity's purpose is more transparent. So in the context of charities, in the context of this second duty, I think that purpose plays two roles. Firstly, it's the central governance concept that permeates and underlies the other duties, but secondly, it sets boundaries around which responsible persons can't go without constituting a breach of duty. So the first one, the duty of care, how does that relate to purpose? By the way, my focus here isn't going through every requirement of every duty, it's just tying them in with purpose. So responsible persons must act with care, skill and diligence in furthering the charity's purpose. Again, they're not in breach if they don't manage to further that purpose. We know with the duty of care in all contexts that the standard varies depending on the nature of the entity and also the person's responsibilities and functions. In the charitable context, the purposes of the company are therefore very much influential in the application of that standard. Emanating from the duty of care, and I would actually put this on the outside of the duty of care out here, I won't go across to the other, is compliance. Now, I realise that compliance is separate to governance, but part of responsible person's duty of care is monitoring and ensuring that charity complies with its compliance obligations. That, I think, so that's linked with the duty of care. As I said, I do have a big sort of chart, but didn't bother my husband with that. The compliance, I think, is linked with purpose in that, and therefore linked with governance in that complying with all those compliance and regulatory requirements means that the charity maintains its charitable registration and therefore that the entity can pursue its purposes. I think if we organise or make compliance emanate from the duty of care, there's that motivational function too. Okay, so the next three standards, not misusing position or information and disclosing material conflicts of interest, all tie back to our fundamental duties to avoid unauthorised conflicts and profits, and I will be coming back to them later. But they protect furthering of the charity's purpose in dissuading responsible persons from being tempted away from pursuing the charity's purposes. The final one's financial affairs and operating while insolvent, I would see as a subset of the duty of care. Okay, so that's a whirlwind, and as I said, I'm happy to talk to you later about more of the ins and outs. What about the theoretical basis? Does this disrupt the fiduciary basis of many of these relationships? We tend to see a fiduciary relationship as one involving fiduciary exercising their discretion in the interests of beneficiaries, in the interests of an entity. Several commentators, though, propound models of loyalty to purposes. So fiduciaries are required to exercise their powers to pursue certain purposes. So Miller and Gold have written on something called the governance mandate, which is basically loyalty to purposes. A fiduciary is loyal if they by allegiance to certain purposes. Fox dissent goes further and says actually the most fundamental and overarching fiduciary duty is fidelity to the other regarding purposes for which the fiduciary power is held. Our own Matthew Harding sees fiduciary loyalty as fidelity, and in the context of the charitable sphere, that would translate to fidelity to purposes being committed to the charity's purposes. There's divergence in the literature as to whether a purpose-based fiduciary model sits alongside a beneficiary-based fiduciary model, or whether the purpose-based model is overarching and the beneficiary model is a subset. I tend to prefer the second view, but on either view, the fiduciary basis of the relationship, it remains intact, if not strengthened. Okay, moving on in this whirlwind tour. What about social enterprises? Purpose, of course, plays a key role in social enterprises. Now, I've focused on what I call social enterprise companies, which isn't a term, but I'm looking at corporate entities mainly, although not necessarily. Many jurisdictions have legislation that allows social enterprises to incorporate. Australia doesn't. Either way, though, in the social enterprise context, directors need to exercise their discretion in considering and balancing the entity's purpose and profit to members. Now, some commentators say this is a two masters issue. There's a tension between profit to members and pursuing purpose. I don't necessarily think so. I think directors, responsible persons, are exercising discretion all the time. That's why we constitute them fiduciaries and impose duties on them. In addition, people who set up social enterprises can predetermine that balance between purpose and profit if they want to, by specifying that one has precedence over the other. So actually, if we come back to purposes, I think that we could see in the social enterprise context that there are two purposes, that directors are balancing the social or public benefit purpose and the purpose of returns to members. Okay, so a question that arises is, could a purpose-based model be appropriate in the for-profit sphere? Now, purpose, of course, plays a bigger role in the charitable sphere currently, but I do think that a purpose-based model has clear potential in relation to for-profit companies. In particular, I think that it could help us solve the balance between shareholder and stakeholder interests. In addition, it has actually been shown, and this was in the UK, that companies that have a declared purpose that's adhered to by their leadership and known by all their stakeholders perform better on key metrics. I think the potential for purpose to play a role in the for-profit sphere is seen in case law on the duties of directors of corporate trustees. So we know that, and Australia leads the way in this regard. We know that directors of corporate trustees owe their duties to the company, they don't owe their duties to the beneficiaries. However, what the courts have been holding is that the duties of those directors are affected by the fact that the company is a trustee. So that affects the duty of care, and it also requires directors in exercising their duty to act in good faith in the interests of the company to consider the interests of beneficiaries, because the rationale is it's not in the interests of the company as a trustee to breach its duties. In other words, the purpose of the company's purpose in acting as a trustee in the interests of the beneficiaries has a direct impact on the duties of the directors. I think that that is a model that could be used in the for-profit sphere. It is more difficult, though, to implement purpose-based governance in the for-profit sphere. So I think in the charitable sphere we can do it without law reform. In the for-profit sphere, it's more difficult. Why is it? How do we know it's more difficult? A few factors. Firstly, the doctrine of ultra vires has been abolished. Previously, as you all know, companies had to state their objects in their memorandum, and if they strayed outside those objects, the transaction could be void. Secondly, Ian Ramsey's done some research showing that companies do specify their corporate objectives, but we see in practice that that doesn't make a difference, and that's been shown in the APRA review of the Commonwealth Bank. Thirdly, when you look at case law involving the duties to act in good faith in the interest of the company and for proper purposes, they're never really about corporate purposes, they're about other things. And finally, a group called B-Lab, which runs an accreditation system for B Corps in a number of countries and which is advocating the introduction of B Corps in Australia, believes that it's necessary to change the Corporations Act if we're to have companies pursuing purpose. I don't actually agree with that. I think we can do it without changes to the Corporations Act, but it does demonstrate that there are perceived barriers in the way of purpose-based governance model. However, there are proposals in the corporate sphere to give purpose more of a role. So Colin Mayer from Oxford, in light of perceived failures of companies' roles in society, thinks that business should be reconceptualised. So rather than directors' fiduciary duties surrounding shareholder interests, they should be about purpose. And in Mayer's view, the purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to problems of people and planet. So Mayer's model is quite radical. It really involves a reconceptualisation of the whole system. So changes to ownership, stewardship and regulation would be a big change. By contrast, and you're not supposed to read this, I put this up there because the slides will be uploaded if anyone is interested. Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, if anyone reads through it before I flip another Frodo Frog, sees purpose as animating and guiding force in governance, as well as of the company's existence and generation of profits. If you like, he sees, and I'm just summarising it for you, purpose is the glue that holds everything together in companies. So in his view, we're not looking at a whole reconceptualisation of the whole system, but pulling things together with purpose. Okay, so those are two views. I think that, as I said, giving purpose more role in the for-profit sphere could help us solve some of those issues we face in terms of the leeway that directors have in relation to stakeholder interests. A company that has a purpose that includes benefiting stakeholders, we could see its interests as tied up with benefiting stakeholders. However, I think that it will be likely to be very difficult for companies to specify their purposes in enough detail to give guidance. I do think that purpose could play a bigger role in the for-profit sphere, but I think it would need a concerted shift in mindset. So not as radical as what Mayer's propounding, but it would require a concerted shift, which I don't think is required in the charitable sphere. One thing I think we could consider is the introduction of a provision like Section 172(2) of the UK Companies Act, which allows companies to adopt a purpose or purposes other than the benefit of members. Now, I've said that I actually don't think we need that. I think that we can incorporate social enterprise or purpose-based companies at the moment, but doing that would signal that it's permissible and give directors reassurance. Okay, finally, in this whirlwind tour, how can we have a model of purpose-based governance given all the layers of compliance and differing requirements relating to governance? They're hard to understand, and there's another quote from the ACNC review there showing that. So let me just give you an example. I'm not going to go through all the duties. When we look at the duties to avoid conflicts and profits, there are lots of, sorry for the unbalanced diagram, there are lots of different ways in which they're expressed. Now I've just looked at the way they're expressed for cooperatives, the way they're expressed for incorporated associations in Victoria, the general law and the governance standards. So just in relation to disclosure of interests, we've got terms like perceived or actual material conflicts, material personal interest, directly or indirectly interested, and our core standards of avoiding unauthorised conflicts and profits. It seems very difficult to navigate and even more difficult to comply with. When I look at these more closely, I think we can actually synthesise them. And I think if we can make sense of all these different requirements and how they're expressed and boil them down into key requirements, it will make it much easier for people to comply with governance requirements and therefore to focus on purpose. That might sound airy-fairy, but here's where I've got to. So material personal interest, Ian Ramsey and I have done some detailed research which shows that material personal interest is equated with a conflict of interest. They're the same. I've also noticed that the terms directly or indirectly interested in the UK cases are interpreting them in the same way as real sensible possibility of conflict, which is the general law standard. So already we've got some commonality. Perceived conflicts seems different, but when I look at the ACNC guidance note on the term perceived conflicts, it seems to me to be reflecting the general law standard, real sensible possibility of conflict. So I think if we take some time to look at these and synthesise them, it will make a big difference in terms of governance. One difference I would note is that the ACNC guidance note, I think, more clearly covers conflicts that I would call non-pecuniary, personal or relationship type conflicts, and a big issue for all of these categories is whether those conflicts are included in the corporate sphere as well. So I'm running out of time, but all in all, I think it's possible to synthesise and simplify these duties and the other duties to simplify them so that they're easier to comply with. And then we could have our big chart with all the different requirements feeding into one. So I think that simplifying and synthesising governance will help bring back that focus to purpose. And I would say it's needed in the corporate sphere as well. So in conclusion, I think the purpose-based governance model has clear potential to recentre and reinvigorate governance in relation to charities, social enterprise and potentially not for-profits. It's more difficult in the for-profit sphere. I think that purpose can definitely have that organisational role, as Larry thinks. We would need a lot of law reform to bring in Mayer's model. I do think that we can move or shift more towards a purpose-based model with less radical change if we want to. Social enterprise companies, social enterprise entities, as I said, there's a balancing of those two purposes, although the relative weight of each can be predetermined. I think there are a number of advantages of this approach that I've outlined. One of the other reasons I think that this approach is important is I think that it could increase trust in institutions, which is presently very low according to the Edelman Trust Barometer. So that's it. I would love to have your questions and comments either now or later, and feel free to email me as well. And as I said, I do have a thick skin, so you can tell me that you disagree. Thank you.